Well, let's talk now to Mark Cancian, who's a retired US Marine Colonel and Senior Advisor at Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good to see you, Mark. Welcome back to the programme. Almost a year into this war, what's your assessment? What have been the key moments that have brought things to this point?
Well, I think there have been four key moments in this war. I mean, the first one was when Zelensky refused evacuation from Kyiv. If he had left, Ukrainian resistance might have collapsed. He stayed and energized resistance. The next key moment was when the Russians pulled back. They gave up the attacks on Kyiv. They pulled back to their borders. They gave up on Kharkiv also and focused on the Donbass. That indicated that the initiative was shifting. Third thing was the massive amount of aid coming from the West and the sanctions far beyond what we've seen in the past. That surprised the Russians. And the final thing was the counterattacks that Ukraine launched in September and October that showed that the balance of power, the initiative had shifted to Ukraine.
So what do you think we will see next? Will the next phase of this war be any different from what we've seen so far?
The next phase is going to be dominated by the offensives that both Russia and Ukraine are planning. We've had about 4 or 5 months of stalemate. Looks like World War I with the trench lines and artillery barrages. The Russians have begun their attacks. This may be their offensive in the Donbass, trying to recapture some territory there. The Ukrainians are building for their own offensive that is expected maybe later in the spring when they have received much of this aid from the West, and also that their troops have received training that they're receiving from NATO countries. That phase is going to be important because it will tell us what the long term of the war might look like, whether Ukraine can be successful in recapturing territory.
And you said that one of the key points was aid coming from the West. There's more to come, isn't there? How pivotal might that be?
Well, the aid has been absolutely critical. Without the military aid from the West, Ukrainian resistance would have collapsed in 2 or 3 weeks. Armies in conflict require a continuous flow of weapons, munitions, and supplies. The United States, NATO, and other countries have provided that. It's absolutely critical that that continue at the high level we've seen. It's important to note also that there's no silver bullet. Some weapons have been quite helpful. HIMARS, for example, tanks are going to Ukraine, but there's no single weapon that's going to win the war. What will win the war is a steady flow of weapons and equipment combined with training for the Ukrainians and the determination of the Ukrainian people.
And support has been offered for as long as it takes. We've had President Biden suggesting he will stand by Ukraine as long as he's in the White House. Elections looming in the United States, of course. So do you see that happening?
Well, certainly for the near term, I think that will. Congress voted $45 billion in December. That will run through mid-July, so the administration will not have to ask for more money. And there still is a very strong bipartisan consensus for supporting Ukraine. Senator McConnell was in Germany 2 weeks ago, making that point that Republicans were also behind this aid. There is growing opposition on both the left and the right, the progressive left, the populist right. So far, they have not had the numbers to change the basic American policy.
So what do you see as being the long-term solution to this conflict? Who needs to be on board to make it happen?
Well, clearly there are going to have to be many parties on board, not just Ukraine and Russia, but NATO, Europe, and even the United Nations with many other countries who have been affected. I think a final settlement will probably look something like Ukraine taking back its territory, that Ukraine possibly might agree to be neutral, not join NATO, but still receive aid from the West. Maybe some sort of plebiscite in Crimea, because that many Russian speakers there, it might end up going for Russia, but that would be a way to do that fairly. But it's going to take a long time to get there.
Mark, good to talk to you as always. Thank you for joining us. That's Mark Cancian, a retired US Marine Colonel and Senior Advisor at Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies.